welcome to Ideagen TV, live here in Washington at our headquarters. Honored to have with us today Mark Fitzgerald, KPMG. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, George. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Minister Bizakis, Deputy Minister, Greek Embassy here in Washington. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
And Paula Tavares, World Bank. The World Bank is here.
Thank you.
Welcome,
Thank you
Paula.
Thank
So great to see you again. I'd love to start this interview by asking a question to each of you. You can all answer. What are you all working on right now that's so critically important? Mark? What aren't you on work?
There's a lot I could touch on, but I would probably distill it down to the top three issues. Ukraine and all its impact. We can unpack that later. ESG, sustainability, climate, whatever angle you want to come at. And then more broadly, what is the changing philanthropic landscape in the US? And how all those three relate to each other, how they impact globally. That's what I'm spending most of my time on.
Love it. Love it. Can't wait to hear.
Yes. So being an embassy here in Washington, D.C., Embassy of Greece, means that you have there's a small, representation, a small government of Greece here in D.C. And what we're working is always trying to improve further and further the bilateral relations between Greece and the United States, and coordinating with our great partner and ally, United States, on major international and regional issues. Of course, nowadays the Ukrainian war is the number one issue that all the allies and partners are being coordinated, and we are. I'm very pleased that we have, now that we're speaking, we have just finished a big project by organizing last week Secretary Blinken's visit to Greece and the fourth round of strategic dialogue. So we are, in the between starting a new project, but we are very pleased that we have completed a big stage of it.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a phenomenal. Paula.
So the World Bank, aligned, I think, with most of our partners and the world, a big focus has been addressing the impacts of the multiple crises. So impacts from the pandemic, from conflict, the increase in inequality and poverty, mostly throughout the countries that we work in, which we know have affected mostly the more vulnerable, including women and children, which is part of the work that I focus on. We know that poverty has increased around the world, inequality has increased, so a lot of the efforts have been focusing on recovery efforts, on inclusive development and inclusive recovery efforts, also thinking of the intersection with, of course, climate change, with other issues that are ongoing. So that's been a lot of the work, specifically for me, focusing on women's economic empowerment and how to bring back women and make sure that they're part of the recovery efforts in an equitable manner.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. It's incredible to hear what you each are working on collectively here. And I'd like to ask you, stakeholders, how does your organization work with stakeholders? We can start with Mark, to help impact and affect the trajectory of their work.
Yeah, thanks, George. So KPMG has thousands of clients. So I probably reflect more of what they're asking us to help them with, as opposed to represent what the firm is doing, although I'm happy to do that for days on end. But what we're hearing from our clients is a number of different issues. One would be, how do I become aware of the potential issues that are going to impact my business, not just tomorrow, not just next week, but 10, 15, 20 years from now? How do I maintain my viability with respect to the confidence in the capital markets with respect to my business? And you can unpack that in a lot of different ways. So as I mentioned about Ukraine, ESG, and philanthropic landscape. So Ukraine, it's going to be impact on supply chain, impact of migration. How do I get involved with respect to my understanding of my existing business, not only in Ukraine, but beyond the broader region? How do I adapt to that now changed landscape for a generation at least? So there's a lot of kind of nuances to that advice that we're hearing our clients ask for. On ESG, in the corporate space, we call it that. The development space, we call it sustainability or climate and so forth, but it effectively focuses on the same issues. So I think the E is now becoming more and more clear in terms of what the direction will look like. As I say, the viability, the long-term viability of companies and entrusting that confidence in their investors. Heavy focus on the E.
Yeah.
But the importance of the S and really understanding how that's not yet well defined and not well understood by many who want to be good actors, have good intentions in that space. There's a lot of ambiguity. So trying to get a sense of where can we lay some standards, where can we get some baselining that's going to be affected and effective over time, and how we can then monitor over time. And then the G is fairly straightforward. Once you get clarity on the E and the S, how do you govern it over time? How do you report on that? And we spend a lot of time, as you can imagine, as an accounting firm, on laying standards that then can be looked at in a credible and consistent manner right across the industry. And then lastly would be on the philanthropic side. We're seeing a lot of our clients, both profit and nonprofits, understand what are the different levels of funding, where is it coming from, what are the expectations of the various actors around that funding and how it's to be used. So the impact that's been assessed and reported over time has now changed dramatically. So a lot of our corporate clients have corporate foundations. So they're beginning to pivot the use of those foundations to add on top their day-to-day citizenship efforts. So volunteering and skills-based support and so forth. Those are great things and will continue. But where else can those corporates play a role to support ESG, to support issues like geopolitical events and tragedies like Ukraine? So much to unpack, but those are really the type of trends that we're beginning to hear from our stakeholders, which are our clients.
We're going to come back to those because I love the E and the S and ultimately landing on the G. I mean, it's incredible. And what you're doing is profound, and thank you on so many levels. Minister Bizakis.
Well, being here in Washington, D.C., you have the luxury and at the same time the big challenge to have many stakeholders with whom we should engage. And this is what we're doing as the Embassy of Greece here in Washington, D.C. That means, first of all, you engage with the administration, the current and the administration that is on stage, mainly our State Department and NSC are our main, partners in discussing issues. We have the big issue of Congress, which is something very different from the typical parliamentarism that we have in Europe. So you have to understand very well how Congress works, and in order to be able to provide the proper messages. We have a series of NGOs. We have many other agencies which we are also dealing at the same time. And of course, we have a very big parameter also for Greece, which is the big Greek diaspora here in the United States overall. So what we're trying to do is we are engaging constantly with all the stakeholders in order to provide, not just for us to provide, the messages and to make our cases, as we would say, but also to feel, to get the feeling of the stakeholders here in the United States, to understand, how things work, and to understand how also Greece in important international and regional issues can play a big role, because Greece, being in the specific location in the southeastern corner of Europe, exactly at the edge of the Eastern Mediterranean, is considered to be an important ally, not just for NATO, but also for especially bilateral. So we are doing all this simultaneously.
And so just hearing from KPMG and the country of Greece, I mean, there's enough to unpack there for quite some time. And thank you as well, Minister, for all you're doing. Paula, the World Bank, as if we haven't said enough, right, in terms of the impact. Tell us a little bit about the World Bank and what you're doing, stakeholder-wise.
Yeah, so I mean, for us, we have a global footprint in terms of country offices in most countries, at least in countries low, middle income around the world. And we work very closely with governments to first have diagnostics that are definitely done in cooperation with our partners to understand what their challenges are, what their needs are, what their development priorities are. So we have our country partnership frameworks, our systematic country diagnostics, focusing both on the public sector side, private sector side, and this is done with also input from civil society. So really building it up from the ground to understand what are the needs and the challenges that we can support with. And then, of course, all our work is, it's three-pronged. There's a finance approach. There's, of course, the the analytical approach, and there's the knowledge approach. So we have the reports and the analysis that we do that can inform our country work in different areas. We provide the technical assistance in some of these. So some of the priorities, of course, I mean, climate change has been a big one. We've started doing our country climate development reports. We have, our gender strategy that is being updated and, of course, tailored to country needs and with the gender diagnostics done at the country levels. And then all of this work is really done in very close partnership with governments, with the private sector, with civil society stakeholders to build with them the solutions that are of greater need for them.
Incredible. And so going back to Mark, I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically. I mean, you talked about so many incredible issues. Mark, take us a little bit on a deeper dive on some of the work that you're doing. I know there's a lot, but if you could pick one.
I'll pick three.
Okay, even better.
If I may.
Even better.
But three levels, same
Sure.
issue.
Sure.
Let's focus on Ukraine. I'm incredibly proud of different elements of what we touch around that tragedy in Ukraine. So one would be our own people. So I talked about our stakeholders heavily focused on clients, but our stakeholders are also our own people.
That's right.
And we have a firm in Ukraine, and many of them have not seen their families for over a year now, once we've gone past the anniversary. So wives and children have left and living in Germany, UK, elsewhere in Europe. And many of the fighting age males who are remaining in our firm in Ukraine are continuing to work. And not only just work, but they're thinking about reconstruction. They're embedding themselves with ministries within the government to help them, to guide them around what a potential rebuild can look like. In our industry, we always talk about opportunities, except with Ukraine. We talk about needs. We don't want this to be self-serving. It's not. It's about rebuilding a country that needs that help from the international community, but also to support the Ukrainians themselves. And our whole focus is about maintaining that engagement with our colleagues in Ukraine. So that's one level. Second level would be, myself personally. I sit the chair of a large NGO based here in DC called PACT. They have teams already operating in Ukraine. And the US government reached out to them and said, can you help us with the health systems in Ukraine? Sure. Right now, not when the war is going to end, but right now, giving them that support. So we have teams within PACT who are basically working with 3 hours power a day from wherever they feel safe in a way that can be fulfilling and ultimately supportive over time.
Sure.
And then more broadly, then we have clients where we can support the clients do what they do best in that war environment. I came back from a country in the Middle East, and it's a faith-based organization, and they have significant communities that they support humanitarianly and socially in Ukraine, 300,000 people. Half of them were evacuated in the first 2-3 months of the war. The rest are in situ, and they need to be maintained in terms of that support. And most of them are in the east or the south. Sure. So maintaining that awareness of the physical threat that this particular client of ours has on a daily basis and still does what its general purpose and mission is, it's incredibly compelling to be involved with that. So apologies, I had to give 3 examples, but just to give you a sense of the convergence of actors around particular issue, and there's so many others. It's really kind of proud to be involved with that.
Because it's so multidimensional. That's what's so amazing about what you just described. And I'd like to shift to Minister Bizakis. I know that we have recently seen in the news a tragedy in the neighboring country of Turkey. 50,000 plus people did not make it through that earthquake. So Greece has been a great partner and philanthropic partner in this to Turkey. I find that incredible. That's when, it's a Greek word, philanthropia. Tell us a little bit about that work.
Yes. As you mentioned before, it was a terrible tragedy, but at the same time, it demonstrated how, the two people, are so close to each other. Unfortunately, the tragedy had happened also some 1999, something 20 years ago, both in Greece and Turkey. This tragedy immediately, Greece immediately reacted for the first moment, not just verbally by the government, but also it was among the first countries due also to the vicinity who sent rescue teams immediately and had they achieved a great deal of rescues in Turkey in the areas affected, and also everybody from many corners of Greece, people were sending help to the people in order to have some initial kind of food, initial clothing, or whatever. I have to say also that the Turkish embassy here was very active on this, and we also sent to the Turkish embassy a amount of boxes full with quantity. So it was something that I think all Greeks did it out of their heart, and this means a lot. And as Minister Dendias also described, Greece disposed all this aid without asking for anything. It was purely human, and this shows that people in our neighborhood, despite the tensions, because we have a lot of tensions in the area. We had wars, we have some tensions, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in the Southeast Europe. But despite what happens in politics, what Greece wanted to show that, humanism is above all. And this should be the right basis in order to have also political relations.
Incredible. Paula?
So as mentioned, one of the priorities for the work that we're doing and just in general with economic growth, but also inclusive recovery efforts has been ensuring that women are part of the process and ensuring that women's economic inclusion is a priority. And so I've been leading work, and I'll mention this as one of the areas that I've been focusing on, a regional program throughout Africa, which really focuses on doing that throughout different countries. A big part of the focus is ensuring that we have the right enabling environment. So looking at laws and regulations, ensuring that we can support governments in ensuring that the regulatory aspects are in place, but also the institutional mechanisms are in place to ensure that women can participate fully and especially recover some of the losses in terms of increased employment, increased poverty that women have suffered as we know. So work in different countries over the past couple of years have produced in very important results in terms of improving legislation, for example, and unlocking barriers that previously existed to women working in certain sectors, for example, or increasing access to finance for women. And then along with that, we work with our private sector partners to ensure that we also have the support in place and that we can work with them also to ensure that the private sector is involved in ensuring that women are included both in the employment, also in access to finance. And this is all done, of course, in collaboration with the civil society and the communities that we work in. So that's been a big part of the work, and we've seen some excellent results.
Well, we're seeing results across the board. So, I mean, I'd like to go back to Mark for a moment. Is there, and there's so many, what is one project, one initiative, Mark, that you're most proud of? I mean, there's so many. I know it's hard, but what is one?
I'll focus on one initiative, which is actually quite different to things we discussed already. Taxation. It's not going to get the headlines, but at the same time, it's really what makes the world go round. How you create monetary flows for governments so they can actually deliver on their social compact with their citizens and so forth. How you create that foreign direct investment to kind of rebuild or accelerate economies, etc. So we've spent a lot of time since the SDGs and even before of engaging with civil society and NGOs, putting ourselves out there, which can be a bit of a scary thing for a firm like ours, to understand what's the morality, the ethics element around tax policy. Not that we're going to judge our clients, but giving them a holistic input around this is what the law says, this is what's legally appropriate to do with respect to a tax policy. It could be an infrastructure project or something of that nature, but also give them some broader inputs. What's the public perception? What are the potential other risks that are not apparent from the interpretation of the tax law, and how we can then create a more holistic response And a lot of companies, a lot of our kind of key clients who are invested in the SDGs really value that input because they are no longer one-dimensional. They're very multidimensional around how they're perceived in the public arena, how they want to be engaged with the communities that they serve, or vice versa. They're very well aware if they don't do that, the impact that has on their activities in those locations. So that's one thing that we spent a lot of time on. It's one of those run and run. It's not a kind of, you're not going to get to an end point at any one stage, but it's something that we're deeply engaged and proud of.
Well, I want to mention, you highlighted the global goals, those SDGs, the 17 global goals. And we all know, but for our global audience, the millions of people that are watching this, all 193 member states, including Greece, I point to Minister Bizakis, including the United States of America, agreed to these 17 global goals unanimously. So we leave that on the table. It's a unifier. And they agreed to these 17 global goals as the most important areas of commonality of humanity to help move the needle. And we're heading toward 2030. We're in 2023, and we're heading very quickly toward 2030. We all remember 2020. It seems like a long time ago. In 2020, January, we looked at the calendar and we said, it's January 2020. We have a decade to get to these goals, to help achieve the goals. And bam, March of 2020, we all know what happened. I'd love to hear, as a follow-up, I know Greece is very proactive on the global goals. I know the World Bank, obviously with gender focus, is focused on the global goals. The global goals are that non-political unifier. I think we can all agree to that. Anything can be politicized, but those are unanimous. They were unanimously agreed to. Mark, why are the global goals so important?
I think they provide that unifier. And we have to understand that various actors have different lenses in which they look at the goals. And so many of our clients are for profit. It's okay to say that they're in the business of making a profit, but can they do so in a way that's more sustainable, more viable, more engaging around these issues that impact their business? So it's not about just doing good for good's sake, it's actually good for business. And then we have other, we have a lot of government clients, we have a lot of nonprofit clients, civil society and so forth, and they look at it differently as well. But it provides something that is not as self-serving. It's not coming from one group of that kind of ecosystem of actors. It's something that we can all agree with it, but then understanding expectations are going to be different. But if there's a common purpose around those expectations, that's where the magic happens.
That common purpose, and I know KPMG is leading the way, as we know. Every day we watch all the things that KPMG is doing to help advise, to help impact, and to help affect companies, NGOs, and the public sector. And how do we help to achieve these goals? So thank you for that. Minister, the global goals. So Greece is, I know, very focused on helping to achieve the global goals. From sustainability all the way down to finance. What has been your perspective on that?
Yes, it's a unifier also from the point of view of the governments. We are under the umbrella of United Nations, and we are striving for a better future for everybody. And over there, big countries, smaller countries like Greece, or even all size countries, can contribute to these goals. And from our part, from a Greek government, the Greece is supposed to be a small middle-sized country, even I would say a small country. We are trying to give the example. So the recent actions of the Greek government regarding the clean energy, the decarbonization aims, despite the very difficulties, circumstances in Europe, and not just in Greece, but also in Europe, energy-wise, due to the Ukrainian war. This is all well known, and also to some kind of old-fashioned mentality sometimes that you have to, the governments have to resist. But leading the way in the decarbonization. It's a difficult word to pronounce. And also, for example, announcing in 2021 a 5-year action plan for gender equality and for protection of women. And for the first time, providing, I would say, too late, maybe late, but not too late, providing daycare units for women who work and to leave the young children in enterprises in Greece. these are steps that show to the international community that everything can be done if we have the willingness to promote such kind of steps. And therefore, I think that Greece, coming from again a small size country, is always contributing in a way of of supporting and giving the example on such kind of actions.
Thank you. That's incredible to hear. And I know, Paula, you've been waiting. You're waiting to talk about the global goals because we know you're the living embodiment of the global goals with the work that you're doing specifically on Goal 5.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear that for our global audience.
So beyond being a unifier, a global unifier, which just kind of, has this idea that we're all in this together and that we're working together, and that if we don't all move in this direction, this will have effects on all of us. What I think has been really important is it sets a very clear framework for countries in terms of what they need to do. It sets accountability. So it commitments that countries make. These are things that we can discuss and countries are monitoring. I know, for example, Brazil, one country I work in, has statistics that they kind of report on and monitor on a yearly basis or on a periodical basis on how their targets or how they're achieving the targets, and very clear targets that can be measured. So even when the World Bank, for example, looks at issues of the slowdown in progress in reducing poverty, this is against, of course, the goal for 2030, right? And so that sets standards for countries as well. And so I think it's a mechanism that sets a very clear framework with targets and sets accountability for countries, and that's an important way to.
And I love that because I think, I like to use the golf analogy of the pin. You have the pin in the distance. And even if it's foggy or rainy, typically you can still see the pin in the distance, the flag. And so it's the same. These global goals are like that pin. They're the guidepost, and they're guiding companies like KPMG. They're guiding governments like Greece. They're guiding the World Bank. And they're helping all of us have that North Star to get there. Will we get there? We've been set back, Mark, by the COVID pandemic, et cetera.
There's no doubt. I think there's factual information to say there's regression in multiple areas. But I think there's also been acceleration in others. So if you think about the focus on climate, it's not that it wasn't there before the SDGs and the pandemic, but it has accelerated in certain parts of that kind of ecosystem of stakeholders, particularly on private sector engagement. It was very nascent before the pandemic, but that kind of understanding of companies' roles in their broader communities, particularly when you look at the E and the S, that has accelerated. However, we've seen regressions in kind of basic health metrics, education metrics, access to both health and education, particularly by those who are more vulnerable, or women and children in particular. There has been regression, but this is the optimism. We were able to advance those prior to the pandemic. So why can we not do so again and use different methods so we actually accelerate the advances we had in the previous 20 years? So you have to acknowledge the regression, but you also have to be optimistic about the opportunities to actually leapfrog in the next 7 years.
The opportunities. I love that. And I know that's a KPMG mantra, the opportunities. And it's an opportunity here. And you see that and you feel it when you talk about the global goals. And I'd like to ask Minister Bizakis a little bit about partnerships. In the past and historically, governments, the public sector did not like or enjoy or use anything you'd like to describe that with, did not really embrace the private sector. Is that changing in Greece?
That's all past, I would say. So what I mean is that definitely there was some kind of, state-owned economy in Greece. I mean, with the private sector, of course, but definitely the public-private partnership was not very developed, I would say, in the 90s, maybe, or the early 2000s. As you all know, Greece has been through a very hard financial crisis from 2009, 2010 until 2015. Right exactly at the point where we are about to regain our development, end of 2019, COVID came, But I need to share the optimistic message about the regression. I think that the states came out stronger, and the special partnership came out stronger after COVID, despite the fact that there were some kind of setbacks in specific sectors. What we see now, at least the last 2 or 3 years in Greece, is that there's an unimpeded, development of private-public partnerships in everywhere, in all projects that the government is announcing regarding social infrastructure or regarding economic development, regarding energy or whatever. There is no more, if I may say, an old taboo about being partnered with private sector. This is all past, and I think that in order to go forward, public sector and private sector should move together. There's no other way to go forward like this. And giving incentives, and this is the policy. The Greek government is trying to give some incentives, for example, tax reliefs or other kind of incentives to the private sector in order for them to invest to the economy, which in a row will create jobs and will create development. This is the only path that we can have towards development.
Well, and that's a great thing to hear. We've seen that with the UN embracing the private sector more and more in other elements of the public sector, saying, we can't do this alone. Isn't that what it comes down to, is that we can't do this alone? And when you think about the World Bank, what are some examples of that, of the partnerships, the importance of partnerships, Paula, that you see?
I mean, partnerships, I think, are a key driver for all the work that we do around the world and in countries. As I mentioned before, strong partnerships with governments, with the private sector, with civil society, but also with other development partners, other stakeholders. I think we leverage the World Bank's convening power to ensure that we're all joining forces and collaborating for doing this important work in country and around the world. And so it is a key aspect of the work that we do. And I see this in every country that I work in and globally. And I know, for example, we partner with KPMG, we partner with different countries. So it's definitely a key priority for the World Bank.
Well, and that's great to hear. And so, Mark, partnerships. I know the stakeholders, partners. Why is that so important to you in KPMG?
We thrive on partnerships. They're absolutely essential to our business, just delivering our services. But we're seeing it right across our client set as well, that they're beginning to understand that it's important to their viability. And when you think about partnerships, what makes them tick? Being clear around the expectations. Maybe before, maybe pre-SDGs, pre-pandemic, was a little bit mistrust among certain actors, particularly in the development field. There's a lot of parallel play, if I may say it that way, between governments and NGOs and private sector and everything in between. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, all well intended. But when you put it together, think of the kind of acceleration that has in terms of the scale and the opportunity around what that can bring. So when you pivot that around something like the SDGs, where you have a common set of purpose, partnerships now suddenly have a very clear expectation. Exactly. The different actors are going to have expectations about what they want out of that partnership. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about it openly now. There's no need to be coy about what you're looking to extract from a partnership. Just be honest, transparent, but have the expectation that there's a common goal. Could be an SDG. That's where we're seeing a lot of growth.
And I think that are you seeing the awareness level of the global goals rise, or have been set back? Or what are you seeing on that level?
We see it as kind of neutral. It definitely accelerated in the first 3-4 years before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. It's stabilized because a lot of our clients were just focused on maintaining their operations and entities during the pandemic. But now it's coming back more from internally. From their staff about, okay, we've made it through the pandemic, individually, collectively. What does that mean? Do we have a new sense of who we are as an entity, as a company? So you see that groundswell from within the organizations themselves. And then on top of it, the executives are focusing on that long-term viability of their companies with respect to their shareholders, investors, and so forth. So you put those two together, yes, we are experiencing a broader set, maybe not in the SDG awareness, but just awareness around engagement around those similar goals more broadly.
And that's so powerful. And in the advisory role that you have, at KPMG, helping to help the public sector, the private sector, NGOs navigate all of this is absolutely critical. And so, Mark, what is your call to action for our global audience today?
Yeah, George, it's very easy to get despondent. We've just touched on some high level and very high profile issues in the world today, but there are so many others. We touched on migration, conflict and ongoing issues in the Horn of Africa. You look at flooding, humanitarian disasters that are too numerous to focus on. It's overwhelming at times, and it can feel like we're having no positive impact. All I can say is keep going. There are plenty of good actors out there, and the more we engage and promote good intent and good actors, that groundswell will become to a level where it's clearly a tipping point, and we will start to see those gains again. So when you look back over the last 20, 30 years, it may feel as we're not having impact, but the facts actually show quite a difference in terms of economic engagement, in terms of reduction of poverty, in terms of access to education and health systems. So if we can have the same and then some in the next 20, 30 years, the world will look very different. So just keep going.
Wow, that's optimistic. Thank you. Thank you so very much, Mark. Minister.
I think that things will speed up in the next years because of the pandemic. What I mean is that the pandemic showed that countries can work together. For example, see the vaccines, see the how to declare the pandemic, how to help each other with the travel restrictions. So countries cooperated, and this is very, very a very optimistic message about this. We also see this during the Ukrainian war, how many international committees trying to cooperate on this issue as well. So I think that learning from what during the pandemic happened, countries will speed up in cooperating and will to reach the goals without failing the timelines.
Fantastic. Paula, you have the last word.
Yeah, well, I think I'll just build on that and say, I think we're also in this moment where we're focusing on coming out of, the last couple of years, still dealing with, of course, the impacts and the ongoing crises that we're facing. A lot of the analyses coming out of the World Bank still show, the impacts that the last 2 years have had and are still having. And so we know the numbers and we know what we need to work on. But I think it's focusing really on the opportunities, right? And that's what I think a lot of the work out of the World Bank also focuses on, is where are the opportunities to do better, to improve, to recover. And I think a lot of it is collaboration, cooperation. I truly believe that. And I think that's the work of the World Bank. So working together, really taking advantage of opportunities to make sure that we are working towards a more equitable, inclusive, and resilient future.
Well said. Mark Fitzgerald, KPMG, Minister Bizakis, Greek Embassy, Washington, D.C., Paula Tavares, World Bank. Thank you all so very much. Thank you for all you're doing to change the world and to make an impact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.